They say the solar system ends where sunlight fades. But what if it never truly ends? What if every mountain, every plume of vapor, every grain of dust has been alive with memory all along, writing, recording, whispering the same story in different tongues? This is the journey of that language. From the burning breath of the sun to the frozen heart of Pluto. From worlds that breathe methane to moons that bleed ice. Every planet, every storm, every silent orbit is part of one vast sentence. The universe has been composing since the beginning. And somewhere, at the edge of light, a few small machines are still listening. Not for life, not for glory, but for the sound of the solar system remembering itself. The story begins where everything else begins, in the breath of a star. What we call light is only the first word in a much longer sentence. Let's follow it outward, world by world, and see how that single pulse becomes motion, memory, and sound. The star rose within itself like a tide of fire that never reached a shore. At the surface, the photosphere, brightness granulated into a living quilt, each cell swelling with heat and then collapsing. A slow inhale and exhale writ in light. Edges brightened, centers darkened, and the pattern rearranged with patient urgency, as if the whole face were trying on new expressions between heartbeats. The granules spoke in textures rather than words. The hiss of convection, the shimmer of scattered glare, the faintest shadow where cooler gas sank back into depth. Above this restless skin, a thin blush of the chromosphere bled into view, spicules leaping like thrown grass in a storm, vanishing almost as soon as they appeared. They broke and reformed so quickly that memory seemed the only net strong enough to catch them. Finer lines gathered over the glow, magnetic loops taut as drawn bows, stitching one island of brightness to another across wells of darkness. Filaments quivered along those arched bridges, matter held and guided by fields that could not be seen except by what they made move. Where the loops tangled, a knot of force heated the air until it behaved more like something imagined than gas, thin and furious. A story that kept its ending off-stage. Far inside the orbit of Mercury, Parker's solar probe felt every syllable of that story as pressure and sting against its shield. It did not speak. It listened with instruments that turned chaos into numbers, and the numbers into the soft certainty of shape. A heartbeat entered the narration. Not the stars, not the crafts, but the tempo set by each pass inward. Venus curved the path like a hand guiding a moth to a candle without letting it burn. With every loop, Parker arrived closer to where the granules rose and fell, and the threads of force braided the air. Closer to the place where heat climbed the wrong ladder and refused to come down. The photosphere churned on as if unaware, yet its smallest gestures had consequences that reached into the crown. A bright point flared. A loop relaxed. A wave that began as an unseen wrinkle in a convective cell ran upward and broadened, changing into something that could shake 1,000,000 tons of gas without touching it. In the chromosphere, the wave steepened, then broke into subtle shock. A hiss transformed into a snap. Tiny flares, too modest to earn a name, ticked everywhere at once. And their sum warmed the high halo like a chorus that is more than its voices. Magnetic structures opened and closed like gates. Where they opened, something departed. It carried whispers from the surface and hints from the crown. A mixture of charged, dustless breath that hurried outward until outward had no meaning. This was not yet named in the telling. It was a presence felt against Parker's listening skin. A stream that formed lanes through space the way wind sculpts snow into ridges. It made the space between worlds into weather. The star exhaled, the air of the system rearranged itself. At the limb, the corona thinned into streamers that looked like silk torn by invisible hands. They swayed with the long period of rotation, then snapped upright when magnetic pressure insisted. Within the tangle, loops brightened and dimmed. The palette ran from white-hot pearl to steel blue and back to clear, depending on how the eye translated temperature into feeling. Knots gathered, unwound, and sent grass. The corona spilled pale wind into darkness. At the star's edge, streamers twisted and fled, and in their wake, the unseen current thickened into structure so delicate it could only be drawn by force lines, not by matter itself. The current leaned past Parker and went on. Its texture changed with the season of the magnetic cycle, with the height of the loops, with the pace of the spicules. It smelled of nothing. It touched everything. Heat collected at altitude, where logic said it should not. Little flares added and added again. Waves carried hidden loads, then dropped them like travelers laying down packs. In certain places, magnetic braids became too tight to hold and relaxed with a sigh that echoed as heat. In other places, openness itself did the work, allowing trapped particles to tumble into longer flights, leaving their energy behind. The crown shone the way frost shines when footsteps cross it and leave warmth in their shape. The star breathed. The breath was patterned but not simple. The inward beat of Parker's returns kept time as the narration slid from surface to sky. No single answer stayed. Each mechanism performed its piece and withdrew, and the riddle remained mostly whole. That was its beauty, a problem made not of absence but of excess, not of lack but of many gifts offered at once. Far from the limb, where the streamers thinned to whispers, the presence that had not yet been named widened into lanes that reached for planets and beyond. The story would follow them later. For now, it watched the crown, listened for a conclusion in the shimmer, and found only the next inhale. The sun exhales, and its wind becomes weather for the worlds. The next ripple of that breath reaches the first traveler daring to face its heat, a probe listening closer than any ear could. Parker moved through space like a blade crossing a sea of embers. The sun filled half the sky, not as a disk, but as a field of motion, every filament alive. Between the probe and that brilliance, heat thickened into a silent rain of particles, too small to see, too many to count. Each one carried the same inheritance, energy flung outward from the star's breathing crown. Against that storm, Parker's shield held steady, not simplify. The closer it came, the less straightforward the sun became, as though proximity dissolved meaning instead of sharpening it. At this range, the solar wind no longer behaved as wind. It struck in gusts that were neither continuous nor random. Pockets of charged particles arrived as flocks, patterned yet chaotic, shifting direction in a rhythm the instruments could not quite capture. The probe recorded magnetic waves folding and unfolding on themselves. Tiny spirals nested inside grander spirals, all threaded through invisible fields that tangled and snapped back into order. What looked like turbulence from afar now revealed intricacy, like lace discovered in smoke. Temperatures should have risen smoothly with closeness, but the sensors showed patches, bursts of heat alternating with valleys of strange calm. It was as if the sun's breath moved through corridors rather than open air, streams confined by lines the eye could not see. The shield glowed in steady defense, its surface shimmering at thousands of degrees, while just beyond, the spacecraft's body stayed cool enough for thought. Between those layers, a knife-edge balance lived. On one side, raw radiation, on the other, calculation and silence. From Earth, Parker's orbit traced elegant ellipses, but from Parker, the motion felt more like falling forever without landing. Ahead stretched waves of dust that caught light and scattered it into a copper haze. Behind, Venus waited again, the next assist already written into its own orbit. Each encounter corrected the probe's aim, drawing it closer to the heart of the storm. Yet with each success, clarity frayed. Magnetic data twined with electrical noise until distinction blurred. Signals that had once meant direction now suggested recursion, patterns repeating inside themselves as though the sun were listening and echoing back a question rather than an answer. During one crossing, Parker entered a region where the solar wind slowed abruptly. Space itself felt denser, its particles clustering like rain before thunder. Inside that calm, sensors detected reversals, magnetic fields flipping orientation in moments, then flipping back. The probe passed through and rearranged itself, hiding behind new layers of pattern. The illusion of understanding stretched thin under the weight of detail. Venus appeared again, pale and veiled, turning slow beneath Parker's path. Its gravity caught the probe's momentum and curved it forward, a dancer's hand redirecting motion without halting it. The flyby was brief, a quiet punctuation in a story written mostly in fire. Instruments looked back and measured the glow from both bodies, the planet and the star, and found their dialogue conducted entirely in light and heat. Each orbit folded into the next, smaller, sharper, riskier. The geometry of movement became the real language of the mission. Lines drawn by gravity, arcs tightened by purpose. Between those arcs, Parker floated through space that looked empty but was dense with charged memory. Every particle that struck the shield carried information from regions no eye had seen. The data came home as streams of numbers, each row whispering of collisions, reversals, eddies, and spirals. Scientists turned them into graphs. But the craft itself knew the truth differently. It had felt the rain. It had learned the pattern by endurance. The sun filled more of the horizon now, its edge a living blur. Light arrived not as brightness, but as pressure. The probe's path trembled where gravity and radiation fought for dominance, a narrow corridor between falling in and being pushed away. The instruments held their calibration. The shield kept its quiet blaze. Around it, the ember rain thickened. Particles swept sideways, up, down, in loops that defied orbit and reason, as though following forgotten rules. Parker watched and endured, closer than reason should allow. The data kept coming, each transmission a contradiction. Closer meant confusion. Heat revealed cool voids. The smooth became granular. Simplicity dissolved into structure finer than comprehension. From the first touch of the corona to the last whisper before radio silence, Parker learned that the sun's face could be mapped, but its pulse could only be felt. And in that pulse, clarity was an illusion. The nearer one came to the source, the more infinite the pattern became. Closer did not mean it gleamed like a forgotten coin left too long in fire. From orbit, the basin's pattern looked deliberate. Concentric rings of ridges folded outward, intersected by long fractures that ran for hundreds of kilometers. Neat as spokes radiating from an invisible hub. They were called Pantheon Fossae, named for symmetry so striking it seemed designed. In the center, a tight knot of valleys converged on one point, as if drawn by hand. Early theories claimed a single cause, the ground above a cooling magma chamber sinking while the edges rose in response. A simple story: heat, pressure, relief, the kind of order that made chaos understandable. But Mercury resisted simplicity. The more closely the planet was mapped, the more it betrayed other motions hidden beneath the first. Some troughs cut across others at odd angles, too fresh to be remnants of the same collapse. Others curved with the planet's slow wrinkles, suggesting they formed as the crust contracted when Mercury's core cooled and shrank. The surface told two stories at once, one about an impact's aftermath, another about a world aging and tightening within its own skin. Neither canceled the other, yet both could not fully fit. The illusion of a single neat explanation began to flicker, replaced by the suspicion that the planet's scars belonged to more than one author. Across the Terminator, day slid into night without ceremony. In darkness, the temperature dropped so fast that the rocks themselves seemed to retreat into stillness. Long cliffs known as rupes cast shadows that stretched for miles before vanishing into black. Among them lay Enterprise rupes, the grandest fault of all, rising like the folded edge of an enormous page. It marked where the crust had compressed and thrust upward as the entire planet shrank, a monument to contraction, frozen mid-motion. Even now it crept higher by millimeters each year, slow as the heartbeat of stone. In the polar regions, the story reversed. There, inside craters that never saw the sun, the silence thickened into cold profound enough to preserve what elsewhere could not exist. Ice. Radar images revealed deposits gleaming faintly beneath layers of dust, bright spots inside endless shadow. They rested in the same darkness that made the equator blaze. Evidence conflicting tales. Some slopes shone pale gold, others darkened into ash gray, each reflecting a different era of eruption or impact. When Mariner and later Messenger traced its contours, their instruments caught magnetic whispers too strong for a planet so small and ancient. Beneath the surface, a molten outer core still turned, faintly alive. The fields it created shimmered unevenly across the landscape, as though memory itself had become magnetic. Those maps revealed that the planet's heart had not fully stilled, that beneath Caloris and the scarred plains, heat still moved in patterns unseen. The idea of Mercury as dead stone faltered. Something inside it remained restless. At sunrise, Caloris Planitia blazed again. The crater rims lit up one by one, and shadows retreated toward the basin's center like ink drawn into flame. The Pantheon fossae glimmered in parallel lines, their geometry sharp enough to look deliberate even through the tremor of reflected heat. From the edge of space, the planet seemed to split between two moods: the fierce brightness of the hemisphere facing the sun, and the invisible calm of the poles where water persisted as frost. It was a place of opposites holding each other in orbit. The illusion of understanding, the wish to say this line was caused by that, this scar by one event, lingered even as new evidence contradicted it. Perhaps the radiating valleys had nothing to do with a single impact at all. Perhaps they were cracks from cooling lava, or stress lines from global shrinkage, or the scars of both written on top of one another. Every fresh model answered one question and opened two more. Mercury's face, once thought to tell a simple story of fire and solidification, became instead a palimpsest of tensions. Heat pressing outward, cold pulling inward, gravity folding both into permanence. On the horizon, Enterprise Rupes caught the first sweep of sunlight. Its cliff face turned briefly red, then white, then gold as the star climbed higher. Below, long shadows clung to the base, delaying day as long as they could. The planet's rotation continued, indifferent to speculation. From orbit, valleys pressed under an atmosphere thick enough to crush metal. For centuries, imagination filled the shroud with stories. Jungles under eternal dawn, seas of cloud water, lost civilizations drowned in haze. Yet when radar eyes finally pierced the veil, what they revealed was stranger and lonelier than anyone had guessed. Magellan's radar sweep began to draw the first true map. Waves bounced through the atmosphere and returned as echoes, translating invisibility into texture. Slowly, Venus unfolded, its continents rising out of radio static like land returning from a long flood. Aphrodite Terra stretched across the equator, its ridges folding and twisting as though an entire mountain range had melted and frozen mid-motion. To the north, Ishtar Terra lifted high above the plains, crowned by Maxwell Montes, the tallest range on the planet, gleaming in radar reflection like polished bone. Between them lay Beta Regio, a swollen plateau pocked with volcanic domes, where the crust had bulged as if something below still breathed. The illusion of lifeless uniformity vanished in those images. The surface was not smooth. It was a patchwork of fractures, plains, and tessellated highlands known as tesserae. Terrain so complex it defied easy naming. These regions folded and refolded upon themselves, ridges crossing ridges in patterns no plate tectonic theory could fully explain. For a long time, scientists had assumed that Venus, lacking Earth's drifting plates, lacked its stories too. Without motion, there could be no renewal, no cycle of creation and destruction. But the tesserae argued otherwise. They were the language of pressure and flow, of continents that did not drift but heaved and settled in place, like lungs drawing shallow breaths under stone. Closer study revealed features stranger still. Circular structures, hundreds of kilometers wide, their edges raised and centers sunk, a blend of caldera and fracture field. They were called arachnoids for the spiderweb shapes radiating from their hearts. Each looked like an enormous flower pressed into rock, or the trace of something that once tried to rise and never quite escaped. Some clustered in groups, others stood refused visitors. Radar maps completed the picture that photographs could not. The plains between the highlands stretched for thousands of kilometers, paved with volcanic flows so young they still held the memory of movement. Channels carved by molten rock traced winding paths like dried rivers. Elsewhere, cracks hundreds of kilometers long cut across ridges, filled by dark material that hinted at eruptions long after the crust had stiffened. Everywhere the evidence of heat lingered, but not the pattern of plate boundaries that Earth wore openly. Venus, it seemed, recycled itself differently, by overturning entire regions at once, a planetary reset instead of a steady drift. The notion of no plates, no stories began to dissolve. The planet had its own rhythm, slower and more catastrophic. Its surface might remain unchanged for eons, then convulse, resurfacing itself in a global act of renewal. The tesserae, with their interlocking ridges and faults, might be the survivors of an older crust, preserved fragments of an earlier world crushed between floods of lava. The arachnoids, the domes, the rifts, all hinted at an interior still restless, a heat that could not escape through the steady exhale of tectonic motion, and so burst outward in great, rare exhalations. Through the clouds, the atmosphere glowed with perpetual twilight, scattering sunlight into a yellow blur. From orbit, lightning flickered deep within, silent flashes illuminating swirls of acid vapor. The weight of air at the surface was so immense that it flattened every distinction between wind and pressure. Sound moved sluggishly, distorted. A rock struck against another would ring differently here, lower, slower, as if the planet's own gravity pulled the tone back into silence. The Magellan maps became mosaics of contradiction, evidence of stillness coexisting with eruption, of ancient scars overlaid by young plains. The great highlands of Aphrodite Terra appeared fractured but not destroyed, as if frozen mid-rise. Beta Regio's volcanic domes suggested repeated efforts of the mantle to reach the surface and spill its heat. Ishtar Terra's plateau stood like a then eroded it. Perhaps convection currents below the crust created these shapes. Perhaps impacts triggered melting. Perhaps the planet's own atmosphere, by trapping heat, forced the surface to periodically soften and reset. The evidence agreed only on one point. Beneath the clouds, nothing was still. What looked like timeless suffocation from afar was, in truth, motion slowed to a crawl. When the last of Magellan's data came down, the image of Venus settled into paradox, a world of unbearable weight and pressure, yet restless beneath its crust. A planet without plates, yet not without stories. Its continents, Aphrodite, Ishtar, Beta, rose like drowned lands reclaiming form in a sea of cloud. The mountains shone under perpetual twilight, hidden from human eyes, yet mapped in echoes. The clouds above thickened and turned again, sealing the planet's secrets back inside. And below that endless sky, the tesserae waited, their ridges and folds whispering the same message the probes had begun to suspect. Stillness is only another form of movement. Venus hides behind her own reflection, yet her surface tells a story of upheaval and endurance. When her storms fade from view, we turn toward home, to the only world that remembers every extinction and every rebirth. The Earth had already died once before anyone was here to name it. At the end of the Permian, heat and ash swept across the continents. Seas turned to poison, and almost every living thing vanished. Forests burned until the air itself carried the taste of carbon. The oceans grew still, heavy with the weight of decay, their surfaces reflecting the dull red of a sky thick with dust. For a time, the planet seemed to breathe only in memory. No birds, no leaves, only silence threaded through the wind, a hush that lasted millions of years. Yet the quiet did not hold. Beneath it, the planet was already at work. The crust shifted, continents pulled apart, and new ridges of basalt rose from the seafloor, bleeding minerals into the dark water. The chemistry changed first, long before the creatures returned. Microbes adapted to the bitter taste, rebuilding balance molecule by molecule. Where the sea had once been dead, thinned the silence with breath. The comfort of continuity was an illusion. Each new bloom of life carried the memory of loss within it. When the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, new predators hunted in the shadows of vanished forests. When one species rose, another fell. Every triumph balanced on extinction's edge. The Earth did not simply recover, it recalibrated. Evolution was less a march than a constant negotiation between fire and renewal. Beneath the seeming stability, volcanic fields pulsed, seas rose and fell, and the sky's composition wavered with each cycle of abundance and death. Across ages, the planet behaved less like a backdrop and more like a participant. Its crust flexed where mountain ranges formed, altering weather and flow. Its atmosphere shifted in answer to photosynthesis, cooling what had once been unlivable. When forests spread, they drew carbon from the air. When they burned, they released it back. The balance swung like a pendulum, each motion correcting the one before. Life became the planet's own instrument, a sensor that registered every imbalance and responded, sometimes with flourishing, sometimes with collapse. Dinosaurs appeared as the next experiment. They filled the forests that had risen from the Permian's grave, their bodies enormous because the air allowed it, rich and warm. For millions of years they reigned in a stability that felt permanent, their migrations drawing invisible lines across the continents. But permanence was the same lie told in every era. A sudden darkening, the impact, the dust, the cold. ended their dominion as easily as it had begun. The cycle repeated: death, silence, rebirth. After the dinosaurs, mammals crept from the margins, eyes adapted to twilight, inheriting a world remade once again by fire and shadow. Between these convulsions, oceans refined their language. Coral reefs returned, delicate and persistent, rebuilding architecture from the ruins of past tides. Shells thickened, fish evolved lungs, and plankton altered the color of the sea. Every layer of sediment recorded these changes as faint chemical fingerprints, a ledger of recovery and loss. Deep within rock, the isotopes shifted, marking each era like pulse lines in stone. In the beginning, the comfort of continuity was only the comfort of perspective. From above, it all looked smooth, but within it were 1,000 interruptions. The Earth was never constant. It was always in rehearsal for the next version of itself. By the time the first birds cut across the sky, carrying fragments of reptilian bone reshaped for flight, the planet had already learned the pattern by heart. Death and renewal were not opposites, but instruments in the same song. The oceans shimmered again, rich and blue, no longer poisonous. Forests stretched into canopies that caught sunlight the way coral caught current. The air trembled with sound: buzz, roar, call, the return of noise after long ages of quiet. In this balance of ash and bloom, the Earth became more than a survivor. It was a memory in motion, a living archive of its own undoing. Each extinction carved sensitivity into its systems, teaching the biosphere how to sense imbalance sooner, how to correct itself faster. Life was not simply present upon the planet. It was the planet's means of awareness, an expression of its capacity to notice change. When the forests breathed, the atmosphere listened. When the seas grew warm, the plankton answered. The planet and its creatures shared one pulse, one long experiment in endurance. From the black stillness of the Permian to the green abundance of the Mesozoic, Earth's story never truly settled. It oscillated between silence and song, between memory and invention. The ash that once buried life became the soil that nourished it. The comfort of continuity remained only a mirage, but within that illusion lay something truer, a world learning, through loss, how to feel itself alive. Life rises again and again, reshaping the planet that creates it. But resilience has a cost, and the next world teaches that survival can also mean stillness. Mars rose ahead like a faded ember, its face powdered with dust the color of dried blood. From orbit, the planet seemed calm, silent plains stretching endlessly under a pale, thin sky. But on that horizon stood something that made even the scale of Earth feel small. Olympus Mons, a mountain so vast it blurred the distinction between under reduced gravity, building a shield rather than a peak. The result was this plateau of fire turned to stone, an ancient monument to endurance rather than violence. At the summit waited a caldera vast enough to hold entire cities, a bowl of night nearly 80 kilometers across. The walls fell away in broken terraces, cliffs descending into shadows that never felt day. From above, the caldera's floor looked smooth, but closer inspection revealed a labyrinth of fissures and pits, collapsed chambers where magma once surged and retreated. The emptiness carried the echo of motion long stilled. Even without atmosphere to carry sound, one could imagine the hiss, the roar, the breathing of the planet's molten heart. Now, only dust moved there, curling in faint spirals before settling again. The altitude promised perspective, but it brought isolation instead. The higher one climbed, the more the sky dissolved into near black. the horizon flattening into curve. What air remained could not hold a cloud. Even dust storms avoided the summit, skirting its perimeter like wary animals. For human machines, the thinness was treacherous. Parachutes designed for descent barely functioned, their canopies useless against air so rarefied it behaved more like vacuum than wind. Clarity came at the price of entry, the perfect view that no craft could safely reach. Orbiters traced Olympus Mons in radar and color, mapping its slopes with light that bounced weakly from the dusty crust. The temperature dropped sharply with height, yet the mountain's base lay low enough to trap warmth and storms. There, the air thickened just enough for dust devils to form, rising like spectral dancers before vanishing again. Their paths left delicate traces, spirals etched on a canvas of red. Each swirl rewrote the surface for a moment before being erased by the next wind. From afar, Olympus Mons seemed eternal, but the evidence of change ran across its face. Collapsed lava tubes gaped open like the mouths of ancient rivers. Channels radiated from the summit where molten rock had once poured down. Hardening into plains stretched the Tharsis Plateau, a raised continent of volcanoes and fractures spreading for thousands of kilometers. Pavonis, Ascraeus, Arcea, its sister peaks, rose from the same swollen crust, their vents long quiet, but their outlines perfect. Together they marked where the planet's interior had once poured its heat outward through a single region, lifting an entire quarter of the globe. The Tharsis bulge distorted gravity itself, reshaping riverbeds and canyons halfway around the planet. Olympus Mons stood at its crown, the ultimate expression of that imbalance. Landers had never touched its slopes. The terrain was too deceptive, the atmosphere too thin to slow descent. From the safety of lower planes, cameras looked upward and caught only faint curves against the sky, the summit hidden by distance and haze. The data that existed came from orbit, from glimpses, from echoes, from numbers turned into relief maps. Even those carried uncertainties, slight variations in slope, hints of collapsed regions, possible lava vents no larger than shadows. The closer one examined the mountain, the more it refused to resolve. Detail multiplied but understanding blurred, as though Olympus Mons preserved mystery by sheer scale. Mars's thin air carried another illusion, that stillness meant peace. But even now the planet shifted beneath its crust. Thermal imaging showed warmth trapped deep below the surface, heat that might someday rise again. The Great Shield volcano could sleep for 1,000,000 years more or wake without warning. Scientists debated whether it was truly extinct or merely dormant, a monument or a promise. The difference was a matter of time too long for human patience. At sunset, the mountain's upper rim glowed copper, the shadows stretching so far they disappeared over the horizon. The caldera darkened first, then the slopes, until only the crest caught the fading light, a ring of fire that seemed to hover above the planet. For a moment, Olympus Mons looked less like land and more like a sunrise waiting to happen, a silent mirror of the star it once tried to imitate. The air trembled faintly, thinner than breath, yet enough to scatter a final spark of warmth before night claimed the desert again. On Mars, heat and never quite settled again. Its horizon was crowded with giants. Arcea, Ascraeus, Pavonis, each a vast shield volcano flattened by gravity's patience. Their slopes so wide that curvature itself disguised them. From orbit, they formed a pattern, a diagonal chain of extinct hearts once linked by magna flows and shared breath. Around them, the ground was cracked, veined, and hollowed. an archive of what happens when a world tries to breathe through its own scars. The Tharsis Plateau was a city of silence now. Its summits looked like islands adrift in a sea of dust. Around Arsia Mons, the largest of the southern trio, the surface folded into valleys cut by ancient lava rivers. The air there was thin enough to forget itself, barely able to lift a grain of sand, yet somehow capable of sculpting whole landscapes given time. Dust storms began in whispers, then built into spirals that climbed kilometers into the sky. Faint red ghosts swirling in sunlight before dissolving back into invisibility. Each storm left behind looping traces on the slopes, wind-signed signatures renewed every Martian season. Ascraeus Mons, further north, bore its own crown of plumes. In early southern summer, when the planet leaned toward the sun, rising heat teased the dust into towering columns that drifted for hundreds of kilometers. From orbit, they looked like breaths made visible, fragile but immense. Scientists once believed these plumes were clouds or volcanic smoke, a sign of life within the mountain. Later data dismissed the dream. No eruption, only dust suspended in an atmosphere too weak to carry it. Yet the illusion lingered, because belief in motion was easier than acceptance of stillness. Between the volcanoes, the ground sagged into troughs and rifts where the crust had stretched thin. Some collapsed entirely, revealing dark vertical shafts that gaped like open throats. These skylights were the entrances to ancient lava tubes, tunnels left behind by molten rivers that had... Arsia's caldera still carried the shape of that paradox. Inside its vast bowl, nearly 110 kilometers wide, the floor was layered with ancient lava, cracked and refrozen in concentric patterns. There were hints that the last eruptions occurred late, perhaps only tens of millions of years ago, a blink in geologic time. Some channels appeared fresh, their edges sharp and unsoftened by dust. If so, the planet's heart had not gone entirely cold. It only beat in longer rhythms than life could measure. The lava tubes branching from Arsia's flank may have once served as conduits for that final surge, and now they lay empty, corridors of frozen motion. Ascraeus and Pavonis told variations of the same story. Their summits were crowned by calderas stacked like terraces, each level marking a different eruption. The symmetry felt deliberate, architectural. Yet, their sides were scarred by collapse pits and sliding slopes where gravity had finally reclaimed its due. The balance between upthrust and weight had broken, and the mountains were slowly folding inward. The Tharsis bulge itself sagged beneath them, an ancient swelling that could no longer sustain its own height. What had once been ascent became subsidence, a long, slow bow to inevitability. Dust devils spun across these plains, weaving patterns that lasted hours before fading. The atmosphere, though whisper-thin, still moved with conviction, shifting fine grains from basin to ridge in endless repetition. In the deep shadows of the skylights, however, no wind reached. There, time congealed. Instruments detected ice within some of the pits, buried under rubble, relics of frost preserved from older climates. Each cavity was both a memory and a forecast, proof that water once flowed, and perhaps that it might again should the planet's axis tilt far enough to awaken it. As the orbiters traced the Tharsis region year after year, They saw light playing over those openings differently. Sun angles shifted, shadows deepened or receded, and with them came the illusion that something moved below. Some imagined life hiding in those caverns, shielded from radiation, feeding on traces of its own history, pulling away the very veil that once made it habitable. Now only the mountains remained, colossal lungs that exhaled their last ages ago. The dust rose from their flanks, climbed the thin air, and fell again, repeating the gesture endlessly. From the darkness of the lava tubes to the bright summits where plumes appeared each summer, Mars breathed in its own way, slow, shallow, eternal. The Tharsis region was not dead, merely paused between heartbeats. Its silence stretched across the centuries. And if one could listen closely enough, beyond the windless void, the planet still seemed to whisper through its spirals and shadows. Once, I was warm. The planet exhales through its scars, whispering of an atmosphere long gone. But follow the dust downstream, and you'll find where that breath once gathered. A canyon carved wide enough to hold an ocean. Valles Marineris stretched across Mars like a wound the planet never quite healed from. It carved a scar more than 4,000 kilometers long and deeper than any canyon on Earth. A fracture so immense that from orbit it looked less like terrain and more like a page torn from the planet's crust. The sunlight slid along its edges in gradients of rust and gold, and the shadows pooled within it as though night had fallen early there. At its widest, the canyon could have swallowed entire seas. At its deepest, it reached into layers older than memory, where the surface peeled back to expose Mars's buried past. The cliffs along the rim rose like the spines of old books, each stratum a separate chapter in the story of a planet that had once been warmer, wetter, perhaps alive. Layers of basalt alternated with deposits of fine dust. Frozen riverbeds ran sideways through the walls, and channels branched like veins turned to stone. The entire gorge seemed to have been written in sediment and fracture, an archive of vanished floods. But as explorers learned, every layer offered a different translation, and none agreed on what language the water had spoken. The floor of Valles Marineris was a labyrinth of chaos terrains, regions where the ground had collapsed into it decades earlier, their cameras turning toward a horizon of rock and emptiness. They found dried channels leading into the plain, channels that suggested water once flowed out of Valles Marineris, spreading across the lowlands before vanishing into the dust. Vikings' instruments detected traces of compounds that could have been shaped by water or by chemistry alone, a debate that persisted like echo. The evidence read like fossils of behavior rather than fossils of being. In later years, other visitors followed. Sojourner rolled across a smaller valley floor, its tiny wheels pressing into fine dust that had not been disturbed for eons. The rover's instruments tasted minerals that spoke of brief encounters with liquid, enough to stain rock, but not enough to remain. And still later, Jurong, from the far side of another world, landed near Utopia Planitia, not within the canyon, but along its imagined continuation in terrain molded by ancient floods. It found water locked as frost beneath the surface, not flowing, but dreaming. Each mission confirmed traces, yet refused conclusions. The planet offered memory without context, chemistry without confession. Inside Valles Marineris, the atmosphere thickened slightly, the low altitude collecting what little air the planet had. The wind moved differently there, curling in eddies between the cliffs, polishing stones into spheres and leaving grooves along the canyon floor. Dunes migrated slowly along the base, their shapes changing with each Martian season. Some were dark, others bright, as though two different planets shared the same space. From orbit, these shifting tones looked like veins of ink bleeding through a manuscript, rewriting details over older words. The illusion of certainty came from the water signatures, the mineral stains, the layered sediments, the patterns that so closely resembled terrestrial deltas. From afar, they seemed undeniable proof of flowing seas. But up close, the evidence blurred. Sulfates could form in dust storms as easily as in lakes. Clays could arise from volcanic steam rather than riverbeds. The canyon's walls preserved shapes we recognized, but origins we could not name. The more precisely scientists traced the canyon, it had long since evaporated, leaving salt traces pale as bone along the rock. Some instruments detected hydrogen signatures beneath the dust, possible ice veins hidden from the heat. In those readings, optimism flickered, perhaps not dead, merely dormant. The idea comforted, but comfort was a kind of blindness. For every hint of survival, there was a countermeasure of desolation. The dryness of minerals, the brittleness of the crust, the absence of any sound but wind. Viewed in full, Valles Marineris resembled a wound healed without closing, a scar that reopened with each new theory. Each mission layered its findings atop the last like sediment. Vikings' images beneath Sojourner's chemical maps, beneath Geron's frost readings. Each one both illuminating and obscuring what came before. The canyon became a dialogue of hypotheses, parallel captions written in dust, none erasing the others, all true in fragments. It was as if Mars itself could remember what water looked like, but not what it meant. As the sun fell low over the canyon, the walls ignited in colors: sienna, gold, violet fading into shadow. The floor cooled first, the upper rim catching light long after the depths were night. In that balance of brightness and dark, the planet seemed to hold its own silence carefully, unwilling to explain what the patterns implied. If water had once filled this place, it had carried away not only sediment, but certainty. What remained was a landscape of memory, where the ghosts of seas whispered across the stone, and the wind, still searching for an ocean to return to, kept moving through the canyons as though the tide might someday come back. Valles Marineris speaks of water that once was, and silence that now reigns. But on another part of Mars, a visitor has arrived to listen for the echo, a rover patient enough to wait for answers written in stone. Jezero crater lay like a quiet bowl etched into the Martian plain, its rim softened by time, its floor veined with the pale remnants of what once had been a river delta. From orbit, the shape told a simple story. A river once entered here, spread into a fan, and then disappeared. Perseverance was not there to watch the past return, but to read it, grain by grain, mineral by mineral, until a pattern revealed itself. The first samples came from the crater floor, dull basalt that spoke of fire, not water. They were reminders that Mars's story had begun in molten origins. Later, as the rover climbed toward the delta's edge, the composition changed. Here were sedimentary layers, fine-grained and cross-bedded, structures that water had once sorted and laid down. The instruments read minerals that only form in the presence of liquid: carbonates, clays, sulfates. Proof of water, yes, but not of life. That difference, invisible to the naked eye, weighed more than any rock Perseverance could lift. Ingenuity, the small helicopter born of experiment, rose into the thin air above the rover. Its blades whirled faster than they would on Earth, slicing the near vacuum into tenuous lift. From that height, the delta's pattern unfolded fully for the first time. channels diverging and rejoining, ancient shorelines curving toward the horizon, boulders scattered like punctuation marks left by vanished floods. The little craft drifted over the landscape like memory, taking photographs that made time itself look shallow. Each flight lasted less than a minute, yet in those seconds Mars briefly remembered movement that wasn't made by wind. Back on the surface, Perseverance drilled carefully into stone. The cores it extracted were slender cylinders of layered sediment, sealed in titanium tubes for return to Earth. Inside them, the planet's past waited in silence, a record of chemistry and circumstance. Microscopic pores hinted at once fluid channels. Grains aligned as they would under water's slow hand. But when examined through the rover's instruments, no fossil shapes appeared, no cells, no clear signature of life. The evidence ended just before the point where hope began. What the rocks proved was that Mars had offered the conditions. What they refused to prove was that anything had accepted the offer. The illusion of discovery came easily. Every image from the rover carried the weight of possibility. Smooth pebbles rounded by ancient flow, salt crusts glinting like frost. Each was a gesture toward life, yet each rested beneath waves. Above, Ingenuity hovered again, tracing circles over terrain that had not felt lift since its lake evaporated. Together, they performed the quiet choreography of persistence, one crawling, one flying, both listening for an answer that refused to come. Within the rover, the instruments continued their ritual. Sensors scanned for organic molecules. Spectrometers broke light into patterns. Microphones captured the whisper of the wind against metal. Each data set was another language the planet used to avoid confession. The core samples, sealed and numbered, waited in their compartments like unspoken sentences. Soon they would be left behind in small caches, spaced carefully along the crater floor. Breadcrumbs for a future mission that would gather them and carry them home. Each cylinder was a promise deferred, a question folded inside titanium. Night descended quickly in Jezero. The light cooled from amber to blue to gray. The crater's rim caught the last glow before darkness submerged it, and the rover's mastcam turned toward the west, watching the sun shrink to a pale ember. Ingenuity rested near its partner, its shadow barely darker than the surface itself. Around them stretched silence. No running water, no rustle of leaves. Only the faint hum of a machine built by a distant species, trying to listen to a planet that spoke in centuries. In the stillness, Perseverance released one of its sealed cores onto the surface. The tube gleamed briefly, reflecting the thin sunlight, then lay motionless as the dust began to settle over it. Inside, grains of Mars waited, holding all the chemistry of life and none of its presence. The gesture was both triumph and surrender, a museum piece planted in a place where there were no visitors. The rover moved on, leaving the small cylinder behind. Its radio murmured a final transmission toward the invisible sky, a heartbeat made of data, then fell quiet again. Around it, Jezero resumed its long patience, cradling its cached secrets under a wind so faint it could barely be called breath. As if the planet were exhaling one last time, the story it had never quite agreed to tell glimmered off metal and ice. When dust from colliding asteroids spread along their paths, it formed the zodiacal light, a subtle glow visible even from Earth's deserts, a breath of stone dust exhaled by the system itself. Each particle shimmered like memory, carrying the composition of everything that had failed to become a planet. The belt's bodies drifted through that glow as raindrops moved through mist, guided by invisible harmonies of gravity and resonance. Ceres led the procession, largest and most contemplative, its surface bright with salt patches that gleamed like eyes half open to the sun. A world large enough for gravity to round it into a sphere, but too small to claim the name of planet. It floated as a compromise between what was and what might have been. Beneath its crust, sensors had found hints of ice, even traces of brine that might still migrate slowly through fractures. The dwarf planet seemed to breathe imperceptibly, expelling vapor in plumes so faint they blurred into space. Around it orbited silence, broken only by the dust it shed. Vesta followed in another lane, a fragment of ambition carved by catastrophe. Its southern hemisphere bore a scar larger than itself, Rhea Silvia, a crater born from impact so fierce it had ejected debris that later fell to Earth as meteorites. Those meteorites carried Vesta's signature, basaltic, ancient, touched by fire. They were tangible proof of connection. Pieces of that small world resting now in museum cases, whispering of the violence that shaped the calm between planets. To touch one was to handle a memory older than oceans. Beyond Vesta moved Pallas, inclined on a tilted path as though avoiding the crowd. Its orbit sliced through the belt's plane like the arc of a skipping stone, dipping above and below. Pallas was irregular, battered, and streaked with grooves that once marked internal strain. It spun with slow dignity, indifferent to classification. Its loneliness mirrored the belt's overall rhythm, each object a solitary traveler bound to collective motion. Further outward, Interamnia, fifth in size, completed the sequence, a dim relic of stone and shadow, orbiting near.
Periodic tugs stirred the primordial dust like wind over water, preventing aggregation, teasing clumps apart before they could grow. The gaps that now divided the belt, Kirkwood gaps, regions conspicuously empty, were not scars of explosion, but the quiet footprints of resonance, where orbits synchronized too precisely and the bodies were slowly exiled by gravitational insistence. The belt was not a ruin, but a refusal, a space where creation never quite took hold. Still, the idea of weather fit better than that of wreckage. Asteroids collided and merged, then drifted apart again, like clouds rearranging in slow motion. Their impacts produced showers of dust that wove into temporary comets, spreading faint trails along the orbital plane. Small families of asteroids shared nearly identical paths, offspring of past collisions. Themis, Flora, Eunomia, each tracing its ancestry across the centuries. Over time they would disperse, blurring back into the general flow, the way eddies vanish when the current shifts. Dawn spacecraft had once threaded through that current, visiting Vesta and Ceres in turn. Its ion engines glowed pale blue, leaving a trail too faint to see. It watched sunlight refract off dust that moved like breath, measured gravity so weak it barely deserved the word. Around Ceres, the probe saw reflections bright enough to seem wet, though they were only salt crusts exposed by impact. The dream of oceans persisted for a moment, then dissolved under data. No seas here, only memory of chemistry. Traces of what water does when given time and cold enough dark. The belt's rhythm was steady but not still. Occasionally a rock broke orbit, nudged by resonance or collision, and began its long fall inward. Most burned unnoticed in planetary skies. A few left brief streaks, reminders that the boundary between worlds is porous. The belt fed the solar system like weather feeds soil, redistributing material, exchanging energy, ensuring nothing ever truly stopped. Its stones were the intermediaries between creation and decay, fragments that kept the memory of the solar system's making circulating among its planets. At dusk on Earth, when the zodiacal light, gravity composes its own kind of music. Jupiter dominated its corner of the sky like a slow-turning storm of color and weight. Around it revolved a family of worlds, moons so large and diverse they seemed like a miniature solar system, each one carrying its own ocean, its own silence. From afar, the planet's magnetosphere stretched outward like a pulse made visible, a shroud of radiation and charged particles that swept across its satellites in invisible waves. Inside that magnetic weather, warmth persisted where there should have been only cold. These were the small, warm places, pockets of motion and tide, where gravity and ice conspired to keep memory liquid. Ganymede turned first, immense and self-contained, the largest moon in the system, larger even than Mercury. Beneath its crust of grooved terrain and ancient craters, layers of ocean alternated with layers of ice, a stratified sea stacked like pages in a book. Galileo's instruments had once detected its magnetic whisper, an echo that hinted at salt water moving beneath the surface, conducting electricity in time with Jupiter's field. The discovery remade the image of the moon, not a frozen relic, but a dynamic world, a planet's moon with a planet's complexity. Its outer shell bore scars of tectonic stretching, vast ridges where the crust had expanded and cracked, as though something inside was pushing upward against the cold. Further out orbited Callisto, quiet and pitted, a world of old ice and crater basins softened by time. It seemed to have escaped the violence that shaped its siblings. Its surface was darker, its chemistry simpler, its core unlayered. Yet even here, evidence of subsurface saltwater emerged, perhaps not an ocean, but a buried sea preserved by the faint warmth of radioactive decay. Callisto was the archive of impact, its face unchanged for billions of years, its craters filled with dust and frost. Where Ganymede hinted at vitality, Callisto embodied endurance. Both shared the same elemental secret, that beneath their ice, darkness could harbor fluidity. Europa, smallest of the trio, offered the most compelling contradiction. Its surface was clean, rather than metabolism. Beneath the crust, the real ocean lay sealed away under kilometers of ice, unreachable by sunlight, cut off from the surface reactions that made the oxygen possible. Europa's glow was not life, it was reflection, the surface echoing the energy that would never reach its depths. Yet the key was not oxygen, it was energy, the invisible rhythm that Jupiter imposed on its moons through gravity's constant pulling. Each orbit squeezed and released their interiors, tidal heating turning friction into warmth. Ganymede's layered seas, Callisto's ancient crust, Europa's restless cracks. All of them moved to the same tidal music. What sunlight could not provide, motion did. The moons became instruments, resonating under Jupiter's massive field, storing heat within their own motion. Warmth flickered in them like a melody sustained in metal long after the hammer strike. From Galileo to Juno and onward to the missions still waiting, JUICE from Europe and NASA's Europa Clipper. The questions had remained the same. Were these small, warm places enough? Could the chemistry of rock and salt water, stirred by tides and fed by radiation, cross the threshold into life? Instruments prepared to dive into the plumes of Europa would soon test for complex molecules, signatures that hinted at metabolism. Others would listen for electromagnetic murmurs beneath the crust, searching for layers of conducting brine. Each mission was an ear pressed to ice, listening for a pulse. Around Jupiter, night never fully came. The giant planet reflected sunlight across its moons, turning even their shadows luminous. The auroras at its poles flashed and faded, painting the magnetosphere in motion. Across that field, charged particles streamed like an unseen wind, sometimes stripping, sometimes feeding the moons below. The energy was chaotic yet sustaining, and within that chaos, the icy worlds remained alive in their own way. Not biologically, perhaps, but kinetically, geologically, electrically. Ganymede's grooved plain stretched under constant renewal, the crust shifting like the lid under Jupiter's stormlight, their oceans hidden but unforgotten. They were small, warm places, adrift in radiation and cold, each one a promise that energy, not sunlight, might be the universe's most patient architect. Afternoon, Jupiter, warmth survives without sunlight. Tides make oceans out of ice, and moons remember motion as heat. But further out, beauty takes a colder shape, rings that seem eternal, yet vanish grain by grain. Saturn turned with a precision so smooth it looked eternal. Its surface, if one could call it that, was a gallery of wind, bands of pale gold, amber, and pearl sliding past one another at hundreds of meters per second. Around it, the rings floated like a frozen breath caught mid-exhale, thin beyond comprehension, yet bright enough to command the eye. From afar, they seemed perfect, concentric, stable, unchanging. But up close, order collapsed into motion. The rings were storms flattened into geometry, particles smaller than dust and larger than mountains, colliding endlessly in a choreography too fast for the mind to hold. The A, B, and C rings stacked like three vast weather systems. Each one was a different conversation between gravity and ice. The B ring, brightest and thickest, shimmered with density waves where hidden moons pulled rhythmically on its edges, creating ripples that spread across hundreds of kilometers. The A ring, broader and cleaner, carried the Cassini division like a shadowed canyon between brightnesses, an emptiness carved not by accident, but by resonance, where Saturn's moon Mimas tugged in precise ratio until the particles fled its path. The faint C ring hung closer to the planet, translucent and delicate, more suggestion than structure. Together, they resembled frozen music, harmonics suspended in orbit. Within these luminous planes, shepherd moons moved like caretakers maintaining tension. Prometheus and Pandora raced along the edges of the narrow F ring, their gravity pulling at its threads until they coiled and snapped back, weaving new braids each time they passed. In the Enki and Keeler gaps, tiny embedded moonlets, Pan and Daphnis, carved their own paths, stirring wake patterns shaped like ripples in liquid light. Every orbit, these moons, the question of their birth had never settled. Some saw them as remnants of creation, a disk of material that never gathered into a moon, left behind when the solar system first cooled. Others argued for a more tragic origin, a moon torn apart by Saturn's gravity after venturing too close, its body shredded into orbiting shards that spread into ribbons of ice. Each fragment reflected sunlight like a confession, bright and cold. The Cassini mission leaned toward this latter story, reading subtle differences in composition as evidence of youth. The rings were not ancient, they were scars still healing. That realization changed everything. What had appeared as eternal harmony was instead the slow-motion debris of a disaster, a single act of destruction extended across geological time. The shards, ground finer with every collision, caught sunlight in their endless descent. In this light, beauty became aftermath, an echo of violence turned serene. Cassini's cameras caught the faint rings breathing in and out, expanding slightly under sunlight, contracting in shadow. Even frozen, the system moved with the rhythm of recovery. Saturn's moons fed and fed upon the rings. Enceladus, the small icy moon with its south polar plumes, released jets of water vapor that fed the diffuse E-ring, a faint halo invisible to the eye but massive in reach. Micrometeoroid strikes on Mimas and Tethys replenished dust that drifted inward, joining the larger bands before falling into the planet's gravity well. The ring system was a loop of exchange, matter circling, dispersing, and returning, the universe practicing patience. Cassini's final descent through the gap between the rings and the planet revealed textures no telescope had resolved. Streaks of charged particles flowing like rivers, gaps filled with pebbles that sang in radio frequencies, ice clumps torn apart and reassembled within hours. The spacecraft sampled the fall of ring material as it spiraled down. Hydrogen, oxygen, trace organics, all drawn into Saturn's upper atmosphere. The planet's gravity had always been eating its halo. The feast was simply too slow to see. Even so, the illusion of permanence persisted in the human eye. From Earth, Saturn's ring was not in stillness, but in the rhythm of replacement. As the Cassini mission ended, plunging into Saturn's atmosphere, it sent back its final signal through a haze of hydrogen and rain made of its own discoveries. For a moment, its instruments felt the resistance of gas, the last whisper of the ring particles it had studied for years. Then the signal broke, leaving the planet to its long silence. Above the clouds, the A, B, and C bands continued their slow exchange, threads of a frozen storm, shimmering with sunlight that would outlast memory, but not the rings themselves. Saturn turned on, disciplined and indifferent, its ornaments thinning imperceptibly, a master of impermanence disguised as grace. Saturn's perfection is only patience stretched across time. From one of its faint moons, a new story rises, not of stillness, but of voice. Enceladus was small enough to hide in a shadow, and bright enough to illuminate one. Its surface, made of ice so pure it outshone marble, reflected nearly all the sunlight that touched it. At first glance, it looked dead, a frozen sphere adrift among Saturn's many moons, a snowball circling a giant. But near its south pole, the illusion fractured. There, long parallel gashes striped the ice like claw marks, left by some vast hand. They were called tiger stripes, and through them, the moon exhaled. The first images from Cassini revealed faint plumes rising from those fissures, jets of vapor that shimmered against the darkness of space. At first, they seemed no more than frost stirred by sunlight, a delicate weather of crystals. But instruments soon told another story. The plumes contained water vapor, salts, silica grains, and a scattering of organic compounds. Beneath that thin crust, something warm enough to boil must have persisted. Each vent was a throat, each eruption a confession the moon could not contain. And yet, the voice remained careful, whispering chemistry, not life. The cracks stretched for hundreds of kilometers across Enceladus's southern hemisphere. Along them, ridges of frozen spray rose like ribs. Beneath the ice lay a sea, its depth measured not in light, but in motion. Gravity from Saturn tugged at the moon each orbit, flexed sentences. The elements floated there, waiting, as though the story had all its characters but not yet its plot. On the surface, the plumes fell back as snow, settling across the tiger stripes in slow, constant renewal. Each eruption built layers of fresh frost, pale and untouched. From orbit, the region glowed faintly, almost too bright,
as if the ice were still alive with motion. The escaping particles did not vanish. Many joined Saturn's faint E-ring, forming a halo so delicate it seemed painted by breath. Every flake in that ring had passed once through Enceladus, lifted by tides, frozen in sunlight, then scattered like dust from an invisible hand. The moon was feeding the system even as it lost itself grain by grain. Under the crust, pressure and heat worked in cycles. Tides from Saturn stretched the interior and released it, flexing the moon's core in slow rhythm. That movement ground rock against water, releasing minerals and hydrogen gas, the chemical food of microbes on Earth's ocean floors. But there were no eyes to see, no proof of cells dividing in that distant sea. The warmth existed, the chemistry was right. Still, the silence remained. The line between potential and presence held firm, the universe content to let the question hang. The tiger stripes opened wider when Enceladus was farthest from Saturn and narrowed as it approached, breathing in and out with its orbit. The motion resembled pulse more than geology. Cassini measured the timing precisely. Plumes peaked when the moon was stretched, subsided when it was compressed. The cycle was mechanical, yet strangely tender, a frozen world keeping rhythm with the tides of its master planet. The antagonist here was not destruction, but persistence, the constant pull that made the moon both suffer and survive. As the spacecraft descended closer, it captured backlit images of the plumes at sunset. Against the curve of Saturn's rings, the jets looked like threads of fire stitched into space. Tiny ice crystals drifted outward, catching sunlight in silver arcs. The plumes were invisible near the base, then bloomed into brilliance higher up, their shapes twisting with the snowstorm Enceladus had made. The spacecraft's sensors recorded the steady fall of water molecules, hydrogen, and dust, each particle a message from the hidden sea. The data looked ordinary in tables and graphs, numbers, wavelengths, intensities, but within them lived a portrait of endurance. Enceladus, smallest of Saturn's active moons, was writing its autobiography in vapor. Seen from a distance, the moon gleamed like an untouched pearl, perfect and indifferent. But every gleam was powered by struggle. The tides of Saturn's gravity tore at it constantly, preventing stillness, forcing warmth where none should exist. The plumes were less expression than exhalation, the inevitable release of pressure that kept the ocean from freezing solid. The energy that threatened to destroy Enceladus was the same that made it shine. Snow continued to fall along the tiger stripes, soft and patient, erasing impact craters as quickly as they formed. The surface was young, forever remade by what rose from below. The E-ring drifted around Saturn like the echo of that snowfall, thin and temporary, destined to fade as all rings did. Yet in that transient beauty lay permanence of another kind. The moon had learned to survive by opening its throat, to speak through chemistry and tide, to turn pain into light. Enceladus remained both prisoner and poet, its story trapped in ice but told in breath, whispering through space in particles too small to see, yet enough to remind the system that warmth can bloom even in the deepest cold. Snow falls upward and outward, feeding a ring of its own making. Beyond that frozen song, other moons dance in quiet symmetry, bound by scars and balance alike. Tethys turns slowly in Saturn's light, an icy sphere mottled by shadows, its surface marked like an ancient stage that had seen too many performances. The most dramatic of its scars dominated half the world, the Odysseus crater, a basin so vast that its rim curved visibly across the horizon. From orbit, it resembled an amphitheater built for silence. The impact that carved it, birthed Odysseus, could have fractured the moon, the shock rippling through its crust until it split open into Ithaca Chasma. One event, one cause, tidy symmetry. But models failed to agree. The energies did not match, the timelines refused to align. Another hypothesis took shape. Perhaps the chasm came later, formed as the moon's interior froze and expanded, cracking its shell from the inside. A different theory layered on top of that, tidal flexing from Saturn, constant and subtle, stretching the crust until it yielded. Each account fit parts of the evidence, none explained it all. The moon resisted single-story logic. Its history, like its surface, was a collage of overlapping motions. While Tethys revolved, two smaller companions danced in delicate synchrony ahead and behind it. Telesto and Calypso, the Lagrange partners, forever holding their places 60 degrees before and after in the same orbit. To the eye, they seemed stationary, balanced in invisible cradles of gravity. Yet they too moved, their paths wobbling slightly as Saturn's pull and Tethys's influence competed. They were like footnotes in an old symphony, brief motifs echoing the main theme but never breaking free of its rhythm. From their vantage points, the great chasm of Ithaca and the gleaming circle of Odysseus aligned into abstract geometry, the whole moon turning slowly between shadow and light. Cassini's flybys revealed textures finer than distance had allowed before. The walls of Ithaca Chasma showed layered ice interspersed with darker bands of material, perhaps from the time when Saturn's magnetosphere dusted the moon with charged particles. Along the floor, ridges hinted at slow slumping, evidence that even now gravity reshaped the scar, pulling it closed grain by grain. Near the poles, faint fractures radiated outward, smaller repetitions of the main wound. Every part of Tethys seemed to be remembering stress, preserving it like a fossilized gesture. The light of Saturn's rings spilled faintly across its face, shimmering like reflected snow. The moon's rotation kept one together by absence. No collisions, no interruptions, just the precise mathematics of shared motion. Each body was both dancer and tether, keeping the others balanced through invisible resonance. The illusion of a single cause for Tethys's scars gave way to something richer. Multiple pasts coexisting, each plausible, each incomplete. The Odysseus Basin and Ithaca Chasma might not even belong to the same narrative. One could be impact, the other expansion. One external, the other internal. The moon's history may have unfolded in episodes separated by millions of years, stitched together into a surface that looked coherent only from distance. Up close, the fractures contradicted one another like overlapping scripts written in different alphabets. As the orbit continued, Saturn's shadow swept slowly across the chasm, and the light along the crater rim dimmed to gray. In that twilight, the surface appeared almost liquid, its fine ice grains diffusing the last rays of sunlight. Telesto brightened briefly, then slipped into shadow as well. The entire trio seemed to pause, suspended in balance, before the light returned and their paths resumed. From afar, it was easy to imagine stillness, to see Tethys as an inert sphere of ice, its companions fixed like ornaments. But their orbits spoke otherwise. Tidal forces from Saturn stretched them continually. Micrometeoroids peppered their surfaces. The gravitational whispers of neighboring moons nudged them minutely off course. Everything that seemed static was actually in negotiation. The beauty lay not in stability, but in tension sustained just short of collapse. In that constant balancing act, Tethys, Telesto, and Calypso illustrated a truth older than impact and ice: that harmony is not the absence of fracture, but its continuation at a slower tempo. The amphitheater of Odysseus, the canyon of Ithaca, the slow drift of companions. All parts of one endless performance, choreographed by gravity, illuminated by Saturn's reflected light, still unfolding in the silence between orbits. Even fractures can be choreography when gravity keeps time.
Own clouds. The parachutes opened easily in the thick air. Winds turned them gently. For more than 2 hours, the probe drifted downward through layers of hydrocarbon mist, its instruments tasting chemical rain. Through that descent, it captured what seemed at first impossible: shadows of rivers branching into deltas, channels carved into plains of frozen organics. It was an alien world wearing the silhouette of Earth. On the ground, the probe saw stones, rounded, smooth, scattered as if once moved by flowing liquid. They were made of ice, hardened as rock in the cold. The surface was dark, damp, and softly granular, a mixture of solid hydrocarbons and frozen nitrogen. Methane droplets clung to the camera lens. Above, the sky glowed orange, diffusing all light into one endless sunset. There was no sound, no wind strong enough to carry a whisper. The air promised conversation, but delivered only silence, as if Titan wanted to speak but could not decide in what language. Radar mapping from Cassini later revealed entire seas in the polar regions: Kraken Mare, Ligeia Mare, Punga Mare, each hundreds of kilometers wide and deep enough to drown mountains. Their surfaces rippled with liquid methane waves only a few centimeters high, perfectly calm under gravity weaker than a third of Earth's. Dunes of organic sand stretched across the equatorial plains, sculpted by breezes that had persisted for millennia. Cloud systems drifted and dissolved like sighs, carrying methane rain that fell once every few years, carving new gullies before vanishing back into vapor. Titan's weather did not rush. It waited. Beneath all this lay a deeper secret. Models of Titan's interior hinted at a buried ocean, a brine of water mixed with ammonia sealed beneath hundreds of kilometers of ice. Gravity readings suggested the crust floated upon it, flexing under Saturn's tides. Somewhere between the surface hydrocarbons and the hidden ocean existed a chemical dialogue: methane above, water below, exchanging traces through fractures no probe had yet seen. The moon's geology was a negotiation between freezing and melting, between organic and mineral, winding toward the northern seas, vanishing into fog. From orbit, Titan's seasons passed almost imperceptibly, each lasting more than 7 Earth years. When the southern hemisphere darkened into winter, the north brightened, and clouds migrated accordingly, exchanging hemispheres like dancers trading partners. The moon moved in rhythm with Saturn's slow year, weather as choreography performed in silence. Closer observations revealed something more unsettling. The lakes and seas were slowly changing level. Some expanded, others shrank, hinting that Titan's methane cycle was shifting over decades. Perhaps the moon was losing its surface reservoirs to the atmosphere. Or perhaps they were seeping underground,
freezing into hidden reserves. Even the haze itself thickened and thinned, a kind of breathing. The illusion of permanence, so strong in early images, gave way to motion measured in centuries. Beneath the surface, radar reflected from layers that hinted at saturated zones, ice mixed with hydrocarbons, possibly connected to the deep brine below. If fissures extended far enough, methane could bubble upward, while traces of water descended, forming transient pockets of chemistry that blurred the line between atmosphere and ocean. For scientists, these interfaces were more than geological curiosities. They were laboratories of possibility, where energy, organics, and solvents met, if only for moments. Titan's stillness concealed constant negotiation. As Cassini made its final orbits, it flew low over the polar lakes, its instruments catching sunlight off liquid surfaces smoother than glass. Reflections shifted like mirrors breathing. The probe mapped faint glimmers of rainstorms sweeping across the horizon, tiny flashes of brightness that faded before confirmation. They were reminders that weather, even here, was restless. Titan, in its inversion of Earth, proved that familiarity could survive in alien form. Lakes that rained upward in vapor, mountains built from ice, seas of liquid that froze solid at night. The final illusion was intimacy. Titan's atmosphere, so thick and gentle, felt as though it could carry that had learned how to hold its breath for 10 million years. The air thickens, the world listens, and silence becomes its own kind of speech. When Titan's clouds drift apart, what waits beyond is not warmth, but reflection, the faint glimmer of a heart in shadow. Pluto floated at the edge of sunlight, small enough to be forgotten, luminous enough to haunt memory. When New Horizons swept past in 2015, its cameras caught the first clear portrait, a world with a heart. Tombaugh Regio spread across one hemisphere like a pale signature, its two lobes shaped not by coincidence, but by difference. The western half, Sputnik Planitia, shone bright as frost, a plain of nitrogen ice smooth as breath. The eastern lobe was darker, mottled, streaked with ridges and shadows that hinted at older terrain. The heart was split, two chambers beating at different tempos, one frozen in youth, one preserved in age. Sputnik Planitia filled a basin over 1,000 kilometers wide, its surface unscarred by craters, impossibly young in a solar system built on erosion and loss. The plain gleamed with reflected sunlight, patterns shifting faintly as the probe passed. At first glance, it looked like a frozen sea, the remnant of a global thaw. Some imagined a warm core beneath, heat persisting in defiance of distance, melting and refreezing the nitrogen into motion. But the illusion of warmth dissolved under closer analysis. The ice was moving, yes, but slowly, through convection. Each cell of Sputnik Planitia rose and sank over millennia, the way cream thickens in a still bowl. The movement was not heat's passion, but its ghost, every energy remembered, not possessed. At the plain's edge, mountains rose like jagged teeth, peaks of water ice as hard as granite in the cold. They cast long shadows across the bright plain, islands in a frozen sea. The tallest, the Norgay Montes and Hillary Montes, climbed several kilometers high, their slopes stained with methane frost that caught the dim sunlight like pale fire. These were not remnants of impact or eruption. They were blocks of crust that had drifted upward, buoyed by the slow turnover below. The landscape was still alive, orbit, always showing each other the same face. On Charon's side facing Pluto, canyons stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers, deep trenches where the crust had cracked as the interior froze and expanded. The greatest of them, Serenity Chasma, cut across the equator like a wound sealed with ice. Near its north pole, Mordor Macula glowed dark red, a patch of Tholen dust carried from Pluto's escaping atmosphere and frozen into dusk. The moon wore the planet's breath as color, a bond of distance and exchange. New Horizons measured the subtle gravity field of Sputnik Planitia and found it deeper than expected, as though the basin held something dense beneath. Perhaps an impact had carved it long ago, and the plain had refilled with volatile ice, heavier than the surrounding crust. Some imagined a hidden ocean of water mixed with ammonia, still liquid under pressure, trapped between ice layers. Others saw only frozen density, no sea, only structure. The data did not choose sides, it hovered between them, offering the outline of a story that refused to settle. As the probe flew past, Pluto's horizon curved beneath the black of space, a thin blue haze tracing its edge. The atmosphere, though vanishingly faint, shimmered with layers of nitrogen mist and suspended ice crystals. Sunlight scattered through them in gradients of sapphire, a luminous exhalation from a world too small to hold its own air. It drifted away continually, replenished by slow sublimation from the surface, a quiet exchange of matter between frost and sky. In that haze, the heartbeat of the planet seemed visible, a breathing rhythm sustained by loss. The youth of Sputnik Planitia had tempted an explanation of warmth, the comfort of imagining a living core still burning faintly within the cold. But the truth was more intricate. The plane's cells moved not because of heat rising, but because cold itself was restless. Nitrogen ice, dense and patient, rearranged under its own weight, sinking and lifting in slow rotation. From orbit, the convection cells formed polygons, shapes that glowed faintly where sunlight struck their ridges. Each cell was a clock, its motion measured in millions of years. The surface that looked smooth from afar was a mosaic of frozen yet moving, ancient yet still being written. The heart glowed faintly, even in shadow, a mark of reflection rather than heat. The two halves of Tombaugh Regio, bright and dark, young and old, remained in dialogue, completing each orbit in perfect balance. The planet did not live by fire, but by patience, its energy measured in millennia. Far behind the departing probe, the heart turned once more into sunlight, one side gleaming, the other absorbing. Between them lay the faint glimmer of motion in Sputnik Planitia, the slow churn of nitrogen cells keeping time. From that distance, the contrast blurred. The heart appeared whole again. In the quiet beyond Neptune, Pluto continued its long, deliberate beat, a small, persistent rhythm echoing through the cold, the slow pulse of a world that had learned to be alive without warmth. The final planet hums softly at the edge of light, its pulse measured in centuries. Beyond it, there are no more worlds, only what leaves them, carrying their stories into the dark. Beyond the orbit of Pluto, the sunlight thins until it feels more like memory than illumination. Out here, the solar system fades gradually rather than ending, a dimming instead of a wall. The great explorers that once traced its map still move outward through that gray light. Pioneer 10 and 11, the Voyagers, and New Horizons drift farther each day, slow sparks escaping gravity's reach. Their antennas, long frozen in their orientation, still face home. From Earth, their signals arrive as faint murmurs. Hours delayed, weaker than a whisper, but still coherent. The system has its exiles, and they are the ones that do not turn back. Pioneer 10 was first, launched in the early 1970s, crossing Jupiter's storm belt and glimpsing the planet's whirling clouds before moving on into the deep. It carried a small golden plaque etched with a map of Earth's position and a pair of human outlines, a message carved in hope rather than expectation. Behind it came Pioneer 11, swinging by Saturn, watching the rings through instruments that could barely comprehend their detail. Both craft are silent now, Their power exhausted, their trajectories fixed. They drift past the orbit of stars that the sun will someday approach differently, and radio waves travel without echo. The edge of the system was not a barrier, but a change of weather. New horizons, younger by half a century, came last, launched toward Pluto in 2006. It reached the dwarf planet in the summer of 2015, revealing the heart-shaped plains and ice mountains no telescope had seen. Afterward, it continued past the Kuiper Belt, photographing Arakoth, a contact binary shaped like a snowman, two lobes pressed gently together. Its course now runs outward into the same night as its predecessors, trailing the faint reflection of the sun on its metal skin. Someday, its signal will fade too, but not yet. It still sends back whispers about the space between worlds, about dust densities and plasma hums so subtle they are more felt than heard. From their distant vantage, the star fields have begun to shift. Not much, just fractions of a degree, but enough to mark the slow drift of the sun itself around the galaxy. The probes measure this change, their instruments recording vibrations in the cosmic background, the pressure of particles so thin they would not register on any scale of human measure. Each probe carries the same story outward, encoded in data streams that cross billions of kilometers. This is what sunlight feels like where there is almost none. This is what space sounds like when wind becomes current. This is what happens when warmth runs out, but motion continues. For those listening on Earth, distance once felt like loss. The farther the probes traveled, the fainter their voices became. Yet the radios insisted otherwise. Even across 20 billion kilometers, a pulse still returned. Delayed, distorted, but clear enough to prove continuity. The gap between transmission and reply stretched to 22 hours, then 23, then more, until the delay itself became a ritual. A question sent today, an answer arriving tomorrow, both parts of one sentence. In that echo, loss turned into duration. The system was still talking, only the tempo had changed. As the signals traveled back, they carried traces of everything left behind. Heat waves from the sun's crown, the dust rivers between Mars and Jupiter, the tidal drums that warmed radiation. Each magnetic pulse had been speaking all along, only waiting for instruments capable of hearing. The Voyagers and their siblings were not explorers in the human sense. They were messengers from the system to itself, carrying its autobiography outward. Beyond the heliopause, the sun's influence fades, but its light still reaches, though weakly, a faint pressure pushing on aluminum and gold. The space between stars is not empty. It hums with charged particles, whispers of ancient supernovas, currents shaped by unseen fields. The probes record this too, their sensors catching the faint rise in plasma density, the subtle change in tone where the interstellar wind begins. The data cross back toward the inner planets, taking almost a day to arrive, but they still arrive, proof that the conversation continues. In that vastness, the concept of beyond loses meaning. The solar system does not end. It becomes translation, radiation into motion, dust into chemistry, silence into signal. The probes continue outward, carrying with them the fragments of every world they have seen, bits of warmth and light still clinging to their hulls. Long after their power fades, their momentum will persist, a physical sentence written across the dark. Somewhere between the stars, the signals will scatter, dissolving into background noise. But the meaning will not vanish. It will remain encoded in every orbit, every tide, every ripple of magnetic fields still unfolding back home. The planets, moons, and dust have been writing this story since the beginning, tracing the shape of energy and motion. The observers, human and mechanical, only learned the grammar. The sun still breathes through its dwindling wind. The outer planets still hum in their silent revolutions, and the small, warm places around the moon still hold their flickering heat. The probes drift on, carrying that quiet pulse farther than sight can follow. They are not lost. They are the system's long inhale, continuing into the dark, the sound of a map finishing its own sentence. And so the story circles back to its beginning. The probes drift outward, but the echoes come